Hi, I'm Pedro da Costa. I'm joined today by Jacob Kirkegaard and Jeromin Zettlemeyer, both senior fellows here at the Institute. And Jeromin, thank you for joining us for the first time. Of course, you've joined the Institute recently, and you've been working for the German government as an economist until recently. But of course, our topic today is going to be Brexit and the implications thereof. And I wanted to start with you, Jacob, because you've written recently that Theresa May, the new British Prime Minister, had essentially chosen a hard Brexit. So I wanted you to define what a hard Brexit means and why you think she's made this decision.
I mean, a hard Brexit, first of all, in my sort of vocabulary, means a type of exit from the European Union that basically leaves Britain without any access to the internal market, and essentially trading with the rest of the EU on WTO terms, or in other words, just like any other country with whom the EU does not have a sort of specialized relationship or trade agreement.
Now, was it in her speech or in her remarks
well,
that
well,
made
basically,
you think that she was taking
I think
that
the
stand?
key thing here is that we're talking about a prime minister who has no public mandate. She never won an election. She was appointed by her own party to become prime minister. And she has chosen at the most recent Conservative Party convention to stand up in front of all her party grassroots, the vast majority of which voted for Brexit, and basically give her definition of what Brexit means. I mean, she famously said Brexit means Brexit, but this is when she finally spelled out what that means. And it means, in her mind, that the UK regains control over immigration, as well as essentially eliminating any jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice from the UK. The way I see that, that means, can only mean one thing, and that is a hard Brexit, because that essentially makes it impossible. It's incompatible with being in the internal market for several reasons. It is, in my opinion, also incompatible with paying into the EU budget. All of which basically means that they have chosen the route that means first the WTO, meaning hard exit, and then somewhere down the line, potentially they will have a chance to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU, just like Canada has been doing.
Now, Jeromin, do you agree that Britain is kind of heading for a worst-case scenario, and is there anything that can stop what seems like a slow-motion train wreck?
I mean, I agree with Jacob that this is the general direction. Now, I also think that the way Jacob described it at the beginning, which is, heading for WTO membership, no privileged access of any kind, is certainly not the way that Theresa May meant it at the Conservative Party conference. So I think what she meant, or what she desires, is she wants to maximize market access, subject to two conditions. One is control over immigration, the other one is not submitting to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Now, the latter, I think quite correctly, as Jacob points out, rules out full single market access, right? It rules out Norway type solutions, because there you do have to submit to a common set of standards. That's the essence of the single market, that you have the same standards and rules within the areas that are governed by EU law in the EU as everyone else. That's what it means. That might enable, for example, the financial sector to stay integrated. But clearly, in order for that to realistically happen, you will need to submit to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice.
Do you think that she was trying to speak to a domestic audience, and that her message perhaps echoed a little further than she would have liked?
She did, but not only. I think there are two things going on. One is that the rhetoric might be a little bit harsher than what she intends to do, but more importantly, I think that the logical solution, if you like, for her version of hard Brexit, which is hard but not too hard, is indeed a Canada-EU style free trade agreement, as various people have pointed out in the past, and as you just mentioned again. Now, the problem is that this sort of solution looks increasingly unlikely just because of the EU's general unwillingness or inability to do any new trade agreement, right? So it might be possible to get some sort of single market deal for the UK if one follows an established template that does not require negotiating a trade agreement from scratch. However, what the British government has essentially committed to is to negotiate a free trade agreement from scratch. And what that really seems to me right now is not being able to negotiate anything, at least for a very long time, just because free trade agreements have been much, much harder for the EU to agree. And I do not think that,
and of course you're thinking of the American example and
the American and the Canadian example. I mean, the Canadian example is really what, when I was in government, we really focused on making that happen, because we thought, if we cannot do a free trade agreement with Canada, which is a progressive government, it's a sort of country that Europeans like, their preferences are not too different from ours, then we won't be able to negotiate any free trade agreement. This was politically a very high priority for us and continues to be. And if it now turns out that CETA, the Canadian-EU trade agreement, does not go forward in the foreseeable future, it really means the UK government is going to have a very tough time negotiating what they view as their version of hard Brexit, and as a result they'll get a much harder version of Brexit. And by the way, this is my hope, that once they realize that, they may back off a little bit from the hard path.
Now, Jacob, what are the next steps, and what are some of the ways in which they might back off? There's been some talk that Parliament might get to vote on an eventual Brexit plan. Would that make a difference and moderate the plan?
I think it can make a big difference domestically, because basically right now they're arguing in court whether or not the UK government can launch Article 50 in March next year without a vote in Parliament. And then the question is, if it turns out that the court says that you can't, will the UK Parliament, a majority of the UK Parliament, actually vote for this? And there the question is, what will the Conservative Party split? Because obviously, if the Conservative Party sticks together on this, and they truly all are Brexiteers, as Theresa May likes to say, then it will not be a problem. But if it turns out that maybe she doesn't quite control her all of her MPs, then she doesn't need to lose that many for a vote to go against the government, which presumably would mean that we would have new elections. So we are sort of in this ironic situation that for 30 years almost, we've always wondered and worried about sort of right-wing, anti-European rebellions inside the Conservative Party. And if there is a vote in Parliament about this, maybe the pro-European wing of the Conservative Party, which actually, remember, was 70% of Conservative MPs campaigned in favor of remaining, maybe they will speak up.
But does that mean that if that scenario were to develop as you outline it, that Brexit really would not mean Brexit? That there still is a potential way back?
Absolutely. We hope so.
No, but this gets into this complicated scenarios, because if Theresa May loses a vote in Parliament over launching Article 50, I can't imagine she can do anything other than call new elections.
Exactly. So that would be the path. And basically, we would count on the fact that, given that the Labour representation in Parliament is a lot more pro-European than the Labour base that voted in the Brexit vote. If that is combined with the fact that the Brexit implications look actually a lot bleaker than what even the, if you like, median voter within the Conservative Party parliamentary group expected, then we might conceivably get a rebellion against the path that the government is taking, which would then trigger elections, which then might change the outcome. But it's a pretty dicey and difficult to predict.
Yeah. Basically, you will need to have Parliament stand up and say, you know what, we're a sovereign, and we actually can overrule this advisory referendum that we just had, which will be a ballsy political statement. But at the same time, as Jeromin said, if it turns out that the economic prospects for the UK is really quite bleak as a result of what looks like a hard Brexit, who knows? Maybe they'll do it.
So, Jeromin, just to end with you, let's say if ruling out this rosy, very qualified scenario in which everything works out and Brexit is not Brexit, if Britain does continue on the path that it appears to be on, what does the economy look like? We've had a severe devaluation of the pound. Some people think that that might boost exports. In fact, the pro-Brexit camp has been quick to argue that, look, the data hasn't fallen off of a cliff and we're doing just fine. So how does...
I think there are sort of essentially two stories of why economically the implications for Britain might not be as bad, right? One is the story that was actually advanced during the campaign by the Brexiteers, which is that, by getting rid from the EU, the UK might move towards a more deregulated model that's more integrated, in fact, with the rest of the world than it would be within the EU. Now, given, I think, the tremendous difficulty of negotiating new free trade agreements, I think that the second part of the argument is rather implausible. And also, let's not forget that in terms of the politics of Brexit, the sounds coming out of the UK government have not been in the direction of deregulation, right? They have been rather similar, I would say, as, say, social democratic parties on the European continent have been advocating, which is a fantastic irony. You want to break away from the, if you like, centrist, socialist-inspired continental model, and you do it and then reinvent that model in the UK 5 minutes later. So that's sort of one argument which I think will not work. So the other argument is indeed the depreciation of the pound that might do good things for the British manufacturing sector. And I think that's true. It may do good things for the British manufacturing sector. But the essential plausibility of a more depreciated pound in the longer run, I think, is linked more or less one-for-one to the fact that the UK will lose its preeminence in the financial sector. And so you have to ask, is this a good thing or not? And so while I'm, skeptical of having very large financial sectors in many countries at a global level, I also think that, it may be in the UK's comparative advantage to be a supplier of financial services to Europe and much of the rest of the world. And so to make your manufacturing sector strong by losing what is arguably your strongest area of comparative advantage doesn't strike me as a great proposition.
No reason to kill the golden goose.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate your time.